All right, today we are going to start talking about weighted voting systems. So far, everything that we have talked about has been a situation where each individual gets one vote. Today we are going to start talking about systems where different voters get different number of votes. So, a weighted voting system is a formal voting arrangement in which voters are not necessarily equal in terms of the number of votes they control. We are going to talk about motions, which is a vote between candidates or alternatives, frequently a yes or no vote. So we have a lot of vocabulary, and then I will show you our first method, which is Bonshoff's power index. So starting with our vocabulary. For a weighted voting system, we have some important vocabulary words. First, we have the players. The players are the voters in a weighted voting system. We are going to use the word voters when we're talking about a traditional one person, one vote system of voting. And we are going to use the word players for weighted voting systems. Now, players could be individuals. For example, in a corporation, if you're having a shareholders meeting, could be institutions, agencies, corporations, or even nations. So as we discussed in class, weighted voting scenarios occur in quite a few facets of life. They occur if you're looking at the Electoral College. You could think of each state as a player with a different number of votes. You could think about legislatures where each party is a player. We are going to use the capital letter N to denote the number of players in your weighted voting system. So we are going to name the players P1, P2, etc., all the way up to Pn. Now, the second important part of a weighted voting system are the weights. And the weights are the number of votes that a player controls. We are going to use the Greek letter lowercase omega for this. So omega 1, omega 2, etc., omega n are going to be the number of votes that each player has. And the third important piece of a weighted voting system is the quota. The quota is the minimum number of votes needed to pass a motion. And we are going to use a lowercase letter q to denote the quota. So it depends on the situation what your quota is. In the US Senate, for example, it takes a majority, a simple majority, to pass an ordinary law, but it takes 60 votes to stop a filibuster and 2/3 of the votes to override a presidential veto. So it depends on the situation what the quota is. Other organizations may have rules where you have to have 3/4, 4/5, or possibly even a unanimous vote. So now we're going to look at the notation. So this is how we are going to denote a weighted voting system. You have square brackets for weighted voting. The quota goes first, followed by a colon, and then you have the weights of each of the players in numerical order from highest to lowest. Okay, so if we were looking at the presidential election and the electoral votes, the quota is 270. You need 270 votes to win. we would put however many electoral votes California has, which I believe is 55. And then we would go with the next largest state, which I believe is Texas, at 38. And you continue all the way down to the numerous states with only 3 electoral votes. So that would be an example of how we write out our weighted voting system. Now, there are 2 rules with regards to the quota. First, the quota must be more than half of the total number of votes. So the quota has to be greater than the sum of the votes divided by 2. The second rule is that the quota cannot be more than the total number of votes. So it has to be less than or equal to the sum of the weights. And both of these are pretty common sense. Your quota needs to be at least a majority, but can't be more than the total number of votes. So let's look at a couple of examples here. 4 partners want to start a law firm. They need to raise $200,000, so they sell 20 shares for $10,000 each. Player 1 has 8 shares, player 2 has 7, player 3 has 3, and player 4 has 2. To pass any motion, it must have a 2/3 vote. It says there are a total of 14 votes. So write this out using correct notation. Now, we have already done the math for us here because 14 is 2/3 of 20. Well, it's actually 13 1/3, but you have to round up to a whole number of votes. So our quota is going to be 14. And then we write the weights in decreasing order. 8, 7, 3, 2. Now, let's change our quota to be 10. So now, if player 1 and 4 vote no, and player 2 and 3 vote yes, here's what happens. Player 1 and 4. Players 2 and 3 vote yes. We end up with a tie. And that's because in this case, our quota was exactly half of the total number of votes. Which violates our rule for the quota. This is supposed to be greater than. So because our quota was too small, we ended up with a tie. Now, let's change the quota to be 21. Even if all of the 4 people vote the same way, they only have 20 votes. So again, we have our quota is greater than the sum of the weights, which is a violation of our second rule for the quotas. This is supposed to be less than or equal to. So now, let's change our quota to 19. If players 1, 2, and 3 vote yes, we have 18 votes. Player 4 votes no, the motion will not pass. So in this case, everyone has to vote the same way, either everyone voting yes or no for anything to pass, which is not wrong, but it's not ideal. So let's look at a little bit more vocabulary. A player is considered a dictator if the player's weight is bigger than or equal to the quota. So if we look at this example, their quota is 11 and we have 3 players. with weights 12, 5, and 4. Player 1 has enough votes to carry any motion by himself. Players 2 and 3 combined do not have enough votes to carry a motion, so no matter what players 2 and 3 do, player 1 decides the outcome. You can think of this as player 1 has a majority of the votes. And there can only be one dictator because that person has to have at least half of the votes. Now, a player that never has a say in the outcome of the voting is a player with no power, who we call a dummy. So if we look at this situation here, we have a quota of 30 and 4 people with 10, 10, 10, and 9 votes. So if players 1, 2, and 3 all agree, then they can pass a motion. If 2 players align with player 4, they can't carry a motion because you'd have 10, 10, 9, which is 29. Here you had 10, 10, and 10, which is 30. So it doesn't matter how player 4 votes, they will never have an effect on the outcome of the election. So they have no power, so we call them a dummy. Now, the other special type of player is a player who is not a dictator, but has veto power. So they are not a dictator, which means they cannot pass a motion by themselves, but meaning veto power means that no one can pass a motion without them. So let's look at this situation. We have a quota of 12 and 4 players with 9, 5, 4, and 2 votes. Player 1 cannot pass a motion by himself. He has 9, not 12, but he does have veto power. So the other 3 players do not have enough votes to pass a motion without player 1. So if we look at player 2, player 3, and player 4, we have 5, 4, and 2, which is 11 votes. They have to get player 1 to agree with them to be able to pass a motion. So when a player has enough votes that they have to be a part of the winning side, they are said to have veto power.